So we're up to page 129. My name's Noel Due and the study is number 15, Wisdom in the Old Testament 3, third of the three wisdom books we're looking at in this session or these sessions this morning. And we're talking about Job, Wisdom in Pain, page 129. Sometimes we encounter suffering that moves beyond the merely sad or even tragic to the truly catastrophic and cataclysmic. So it is when we encounter the story of Job, whose sufferings seem so overwhelming and whose trial seems so demanding that we despair of words to describe it. Deep within the recesses of our hearts and minds, Job's suffering also stirs troubling questions for us. They encompass the simply selfish and move to the deeply theological. How would we cope if we were faced with suffering on this scale? Do we hide from the possibility and whistle in the dark by somehow thinking that we will be immune from such pain? Do we base the hope of any immunity on the fact that we have surely not done anything to deserve being made such an object lesson? Do we now, in these heady New Testament days, have a God who is other than the one we meet in the opening and closing chapters of Job? Or do we perhaps hope that Job's experience is, after all, allegorical, and that God should not expect such grief to be borne by anyone in actual life? And how do we cope with the picture of God in the prologue, who is clearly portrayed as the one in whose will Job's affliction ultimately lies? And the epilogue, where it sometimes seems that Job's complaints and questions are not even addressed by God. And in all this, where can we find a true theodicy? Some of the commentaries of Job are deeply cynical. And if they come at it from a position of no faith, they look at Job's complaint and Job's questions and say, well, whoever composed the Yahweh speeches towards the end of Job, they clearly didn't have any answers. Top of page 130. Feinberg has suggested that the book of Job deals with one central theme, suffering, and particularly God's role in it. And that gives rise to 5 main questions. 1, can man serve God disinterestedly from pure love of him, or is all his worship of God tainted with ulterior and selfish motives? Secondly, is there anyone but God to whom the control of the circumstances of human life can be attributed? Thirdly, are man's outward circumstances a criterion and standard of his moral character and life before God? Can men, by their wisdom, rightly and completely comprehend the workings of the providence of God? And 5, since the righteous do endure such great afflictions in this life, is a life of righteousness worth it in the last analysis? Those 5 questions, in one form or another, you will find resurfacing every time people come through substantial issues of suffering. You've probably asked them yourself, of yourself, about yourself. Helpful though these questions are, and they are all addressed in Job, we would be wise to heed Westerman's comment that the book of Job cannot be understood outside the Old Testament category of lament. And this must affect our interpretation of it. This means that Job is not formulated to address the problems of suffering as though it were a philosophical conundrum to be solved. A lament is something fundamentally different from a treatment of the problem of suffering. A lament does not arise out of mournful reflection on suffering. On the contrary, a lament is an existential process which has its own structure. Thus, in the disputations with Job's friends, we see their doctrinal formulations do not touch the depths of Job's anguish, which can only be addressed by God himself. This then focuses the question of purpose even further. Biblically, we cannot give attention to the problem of suffering qua suffering. Suffering as though suffering could be analysed just as a thing in itself. We can only give attention to the matter of suffering in the face of the revealed nature and character of God. The problems and perplexities raised in the book of Job only take their shape from the underlying creation and covenant theology of the Bible. In the realm of biblical revelation, suffering becomes an issue because of words like holiness, righteousness, justice, mercy, love, faithfulness, goodness, truth and grace. Words which attach to God's self-revelation. The perplexity raised by Job is not that Job suffers, nor even that he suffers by God's will, but the God whose will brings the terrible sufferings into Job's life has revealed himself to be of a certain moral character. That's the problem. He's not just the sovereign transcendent creator, but the one who enters into covenant relationship with his people by his own gracious initiative. Rightly, we confess we believe in God the Father, Almighty. This is the nub of the problem in Job. How do Father and Almighty square with one another, particularly where the Almighty seems to wager on Job in a test designed to upstage his, that is God's, adversary? But even if theological formulation is a step too far for the Joban era, Job would have had no doubt in asserting that we believe in the Most High, covenant Father of his people and righteous Judge of all the earth. Either way, the suffering is a problem because of God, not merely because of the suffering. Do not let it be put on you that you are a Christian, therefore you have to explain suffering. Every human being somehow has to come to some point where they have some rationale, reason, explanation, experience of suffering, and to think that it lies with Christians to explain it is completely false. But we are confronted with something as Christians which the rest of the world is not confronted with, because we believe in God the Father. In the Psalms of Lament, it is only God who can address the person suffering, and it is therefore to God that the complaints, petitions and prayers are poured out. In like manner, the book of Job must take us beyond the mere human formulations and even beyond the formulations of traditional covenant wisdom when these are callously expressed or wrongly applied, to bring us to an encounter with Yahweh himself. Though in his speeches Job may only echo the fragments of the language of prayer, even parodying prayer in some of his responses, still in his deepest distress Job knows it is God with whom he has to do. And Job will not let God off the hook. He demands that God answers his complaint. But even these demands are an implicit expression of faith. Job's wife urges him, curse God and die, to which Job responds with a remarkable statement of faith in which he voices the fact that to curse God is to speak as a fool. True, Job later speaks unwisely, but he never becomes the quintessential fool understood as a moral description in the Old Testament. For example, in Psalm 14, he persists in faith, albeit in angry and restive faith, but faith that will and must engage with God himself. Even his protest against his own existence, I wish I'd never been born, how many times have we said that to ourselves, is a protest against the God who gives and takes away and who has not taken away Job's life. He looks and longs for God to show himself, so that he might deal with God face to face and present his case before him. It is an encounter with him. It is encounter with him that the matter must be settled. The structure of the book of Job, if you just turn across to the last page, page 143, you'll see what to my mind is a very elegant diagrammatic construction of how the book of Job balances out around the central chapter dealing with wisdom. You can look at all of that in your own time and bear it in mind as we perhaps go through these category headings on page 131. Job may be conveniently divided into 5 sections. The prologue presents us with an introduction to the character of Job himself and shows us, the reader, the scene in heaven and the dialogue between Yahweh and the Satan. It then describes the tragedies of loss and physical affliction that Job is given to endure and the arrival of the 3 friends. The prologue ends with the friends sitting in silence with Job for a week. The disputation begins with Job breaking his silence with a bitter outpouring in which he curses the day of his birth and longs for death. This is followed by 3 speech cycles from Eliphaz, Bildad and Zophar in dialogue with Job. The 3rd cycle of speeches is incomplete, with Bildad's last utterance comprising the shortest chapter in the book and Zophar making no reply at all. Next comes the Elihu speeches, 32 to 37. Elihu's presence had not been recorded up to this point, so he's presented as a listener to the conversations thus far. He's a young man who's distressed both by Job's protestations of self-righteousness and the insufficient answers of the other 3 friends. He proposes his own answers in 4 speeches. Commentators are divided as to whether he provides any new material or simply rehashes the other friends' views, albeit with the strident brazenness of youth. Those who take the view that he does provide some material, at least that he casts the issues in a different form, see his presence as preparing the way for the Yahweh speeches. The Yahweh speeches follow next, and they occur in the context of a theophanic storm, a storm which reveals the presence of Yahweh. They are replete with questions, approximately 70 of them. None of them are ones that you or I can answer, except for things like, were you there when I laid the foundation of the earth? We can answer that one. No. But none of them are designed for human beings to know. They are related to the hidden ways of creation and the Lord's dealings with it, and demand answers from Job or anyone that we are unable to give. This encounter ends with Job's recanting from his pride and ignorant complaining, and with the acknowledgement that he has spoken unwisely. The conclusion begins with Yahweh's rebuke of Eliphaz, Bildad and Zophar. Elihu is not mentioned. The friends are commanded to offer sacrifices and seek Job's prayer for them. In this way, Job acts as an intercessor priest to his friends, and God refrains from dealing with them according to their foolishness. Job's fortunes are then restored, and he is presented as living a long life of contentment and blessing with his new family and descendants to the 4th generation. Significant figure in the light of Deuteronomy. And then I just make reference to the diagram at the back of the book. There are a number of very significant interpretive issues. I'll let you read those through because they're not really germane to our paper, but they are issues that you might need to come to if you're going to preach through a series on Job, how you're going to approach all of those. Elihu, the place of Elihu is one of them. It says in one place, Elihu stands up at the beginning of his speeches and says, I'm a young man, and because of the play on words, ruach, breath or wind, I'm full of breath. Some translations say I'm full of wind and weary of holding it in. So it depends on whether you want to take it positively or negatively. But the last paragraph at the bottom of that list of interpretive issues, in the light, on page 133, in the light of the difficulty and diversity that such theories present, perhaps we are being told that there is no one key that will unlock the meaning of the book. We must let it speak to us in all its complexity without trying to subject it to our own desire to reduce the turmoil and perplexity of suffering to neat systems of interpretation. Indeed, To do so would be to reproduce the error of Job's friends. So let's move on to the theme of the friends' arguments. Mattia's comment is apposite. Job's friends came to sympathise and unfortunately stay to explain. It is the explaining part that dominates the disputations in Job. In the end, all of the disputations hinge on one point. Is Job's suffering retributive? In Job 1:1 we have a significant pointer to the answer. We are told there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. This description of Job delineates him in brief compass as the archetypal sage, and who thus represents the pattern of life under the covenant for the man who fears God. This picture of divine approval is further underscored by Job 42:8, where the three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad and Zophar, are told, "Now therefore take 7 bulls and 7 rams, go to my servant Job, offer up a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept his prayer, not to deal with you according to your folly. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." The narrator's unreserved, positive attestation to Job's character, Yahweh's confirmation of this in his own statements to the Satan, and the role of the Satan himself in the afflictions are all alike occluded from the view of the friends. That means they're hidden from them. The friends don't have that information. We, the readers, are thus given a double perspective. What is really happening in heaven versus the interpretation placed on events by Job and his friends. Job's friends have only one view, that suffering is retributive. As Calvin has said, the friends have no more songs but one, and no regard at all to whom they sing it. In various ways, Eliphaz, Bildad and Zophar all argue from the seen to the unseen. Job's suffering has been extreme, and ipso facto, Job must be very wicked. The friends push and pressure Job to get him to acknowledge that this is the case, to force him to repentance and acknowledge that that what he has received is nothing more than just and fair retribution for his albeit hidden wickedness. Suffering of such magnitude must indicate that he has been a sinner of equal or greater magnitude. The events portrayed to the reader in the prologue, the affirmations of Job as a wise man, and the condemnation of the friend's so-called counsel all indicate that Job's suffering lies outside the realm of retributive justice. However, in their various speeches, the friends indicate that they lack the true wisdom needed to take into account things that are not seen. For example, in Eliphaz's first speech, he turns to Job with cruelty, assessing him by implication to be a fool. By contrast, he aligns himself with the actions and attitudes of the wise. The basic pose adopted by Eliphaz is reiterated by Bildad and also by Zophar. The speeches in Job occur in 3 cycles, each punctuated by a response from Job. The last of the cycles is incomplete, with Bildad giving only the briefest of comments, and Zophar not making any contribution at the end of the 3rd cycle. This structure indicates that the friends' arguments have run out of steam, and that Job remains unanswered from the stores of conventional wisdom. However, as we read the friends' contributions, many of the speeches have what we might call a yes but quality about them. Lots of the theological statements in the speeches are true, but they are either wrongly applied or is used as the basis for what are ultimately shown to be wrong conclusions. Sometimes we find ourselves standing with the friends, being persuaded that by their theological statements and siding with them against Job, only to be confronted with the fact that the friends are declared to have spoken foolishness. And then on the other side, Job is vindicated but not without him recanting and repenting in dust and ashes, so we cannot simply take his side in the matter either. The issue then is the callous simplicity in which the friends reduce all complexities to one point. The stance needs no faith, and thus it finally falls to the ground as unbiblical. Alec Mattia comments that the friends have a true conception that God's world must be governed by God's justice, which they see as working in an observable nexus between sin and adversity, virtue and reward. The friends' error lies in their view that there is an observable nexus between sin and adversity, justice and reward, in their reduction of God to the compass of human understanding. Instead of an attitude of faith, waiting until the holy and just God works his moral purposes out, theirs is an attitude of logic. They are sure that they can trace out the pathways of divine and moral providence in rewarding and punishing. At the end of chapter 31, we've reached an impasse. The friends have no further arguments. Job has not budged an inch. God has not spoken. There seems to be no way forward. Enter Elihu. As indicated earlier, Elihu's contribution has been variously evaluated, ranging as anywhere from interpreting him as a theological bigot to a theological hero. At the one end, commentators suggest that he brings nothing new, and what he does bring comes with all the unthinking, hot-headed presumption of youthful self-importance. In this view, the ultimate coup de grace for a foolish theology is to have it presented by an unsympathetic spokesman who is so muddle-headed and ridiculous, no character or even the narrator will deign to acknowledge his presence either before or after his appearance. Elihu is the reductio ad absurdum of traditional theology. Once he's spoken, traditional dogma can no longer be defended. At the other end, Elihu is seen as a helpful precursor to the Yahweh speeches, a voice of true wisdom and a theological hero of sorts, bringing a new and helpful perspective in contrast to the traditional wisdom of the other three friends. Whatever the commentators make of his contribution, Elihu certainly seems to think that he does have something new to bring, and he's insistent that he should be heard. His are the only uninterrupted speeches in the book, apart from Yahweh's, since he is dissatisfied both with the friends' arguments and with Job's replies. He, though young, is now emboldened to speak up. If there's anything new in Elihu, it is his recasting of retributive justice to chastening discipline. And in that, he insists Job is wrong in complaining against God. In some ways, he prepares for the Yahweh speeches, after which Job is left covering his mouth in silence. Job's responses. It's self-evident that the quid pro quo understanding of Job's suffering portrayed by the friends is not shared by Job. Job makes responses to the speeches of the friends, with the exception of Elihu, and also to the theophanic words of Yahweh. However, these responses reveal that Job himself is not quite as free from the assumptions that his friends bring to the ash heap as we might first think. On the one hand, we can suggest that it is Job's deep understanding of God's character and his certainty of his own integrity before him that enables him to withstand the battering of his three friends for so long. In their speeches, the friends move from a relatively gentle opening in the first few paragraphs of Eliphaz's first speech through the progressive cycles to become deeply hardened and even brutal towards Job, to the point of fabricating dire accusations of wrongdoing to justify their position. They become exasperated that Job will not simply acknowledge what must be plain for all to see. He sinned greatly, and his calamities are the direct result of his guilt. But Job, despite all that he's going through and all his complaints against God, utters some remarkable statements of trust in God who has afflicted him. Essentially, he appeals to God against God. This is the stuff of gutsy faith and parallels the intercession of Moses, for example, in pleading the name of God against God's own words of judgment upon Israel. But on the other hand, Job's protestations against his friend's accusations and his stubborn refusal to compromise his position are all directed by the same moral compass as Eliphaz and his companions. They argue that the suffering makes moral sense. Job argues that it does not make moral sense because he's done nothing to deserve it. Both assume it should make moral sense in a retributive universe. Both Job and his friends share the assumption, therefore, of retributive justice as the foundation of God's dealings with men. This is further seen in the way in which Job presses his case with God. Job longs for a legal confrontation with the Lord, in effect, to put God on trial for the trial that he had placed on Job. The friends assert God's sovereignty, as does Job, but they suggest that his suffering is indeed just. They see a direct and causal relationship being worked out. Job repeatedly asks for an explanation from God, but by way of counter-evidence, he repeatedly protests his innocence from the charges brought against him by his friends. Job also points out what he takes to be the failures of God's moral government. The good suffer, the wicked prosper, and God seems not to intervene. Job longs for a mediator to represent him before God so that he can get a fair trial in God's courthouse. Taken together, these sentiments indicate that Job presupposes the same point as the friends. The difference is that if Job were given a chance to take it up with God, Job would be able to show that in God's balance, Job's failures do not deserve the punishment he's receiving. Both Job and his friends take as unquestionable the assumption that justice, specifically retributive justice, should be the central principle of reality. They disagree only as to whether such justice is operative in the world or whether God should be called to account for failing to enforce such justice. That's what we're about in the world, isn't it? Not that there is a God or not, but he's not doing what he ought to do. The speeches of God from the whirlwind, however, challenge the paradigm that both Job and the friends have taken for granted. When God speaks of the design of the cosmos, which Job has obscured, the categories that underlie God's descriptions are not categories of justice, injustice, but order and chaos. Job's responses a step too far. As the book unfolds, it emerges that Job's cavilling against God moves from mere lament to pride. When Job 8:32 is compared to 42 verse 3, it indicates that one who has darkened the Lord's counsel without knowledge is Job himself. Job was indeed righteous in his own eyes, and there is no doubt at all about the blamelessness of his conduct. The description of Job's character in the prologue will not let us adopt any other view than the fact that he was a man who really did walk uprightly. Pride, the most deadly of all sins, lies within us all. In some, such as Nebuchadnezzar, it is revealed in a time of prosperity and blessing. In others, it is revealed in a time of suffering, particularly that suffering which is or is perceived to be unjust suffering. Job falls into the latter category. To bring out the full import of Job's stance, says Hartley, God laid before him the option of either ascending to the throne of the universe and ruling better than he did, or of abandoning his complaint. God was disclosing to Job that if he persisted in his claim of innocence, he was in essence exalting himself above God. Such stubbornness would lead him into committing the quintessential sin of hubris. In Job 42, verse 5 to 6, we hear of Job's own testimony, that he had heard of God with his ears, but now met him face to face, and that encounter led him to abase himself before God and publicly declare the insufficiency of his utterances. There is repentance involved here, which leads Job to finally place his hand upon his mouth and utter no more words. I'll come back to, we won't read that next bit because it's got some Hebrew quotes in it. In his undoubted moral integrity, Job had unwittingly become one in whom the sin of pride had taken deep root. This lay unrecognised, dormant, so to speak, until the testing time came. Because Job's theological framework did not provide wide enough horizons to count for Job's particular suffering, this gave the opportunity for the latent sediment to be stirred up. Thus, in his protestations against God, Job's problem had extended further than simply asking silly questions. Job had been angry with God. In being angry, he had entered into judgment of God and his ways. God had been placed in the dock. Job had, in effect, set himself above God. He had committed man's most prevalent sin, making himself a god. Job must now face a deeper reality than his own ignorance. He must face up to the sinfulness of his response. If Job had been morally blameless before the trial, he had not been so during it. Now that's a quote from Derek Thomas, a small book on a daily devotional book on Job called Mining for Wisdom. Derek teaches at Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, but did his PhD through Highland Theological College. And the PhD was on Calvin's Sermons on Job. It's a really, really good PhD, but it's now published. And I can't recall for the moment the title of the published form, but if you were to look Derek Thomas Job Sermons or Derek Thomas Calvin Sermons on Job, you'll be able to find it. It's a very fine volume. Through it all, Job is brought to confess his ignorance and to repent of his pride, but this does not occur in a way that matches what the friends were looking for. The unwise utterances that Job made during his trial were not the cause of the trial. Job's sufferings was not because he had sinned a particular sin which had brought the calamity upon his own head. The flat earth, retributive justice theology of shallow contemporary wisdom is shown to have failed completely. In the deep statements of trust that Job had uttered in the midst of the trial, backing God against God, so to speak, the Satan's position had also been shown to be false. Job is vindicated by God, and in some senses God has been vindicated by Job. The adversary has been put down. But Job himself has not come through unchanged and untouched. He starts out sitting in silence for 7 days, and he ends up covering his mouth and withholding his words. And when he does speak in response to Yahweh, all the hurt, pride, anger and complaint has been removed. No longer is there a brooding silence, but a calmed and restful stillness. No longer does he want to put God on trial, but is quiet under his hand. If we can speak in the poetic manner of the book, the Lord has drawn out the hidden Leviathan in Job's depths, and he has indeed come forth as gold. In all that we've said, we've assumed the content of the Yahweh speeches without expounding them. Very briefly, firstly, it's to be noted the speeches are written in a particular style, replete with questions, and these in a rapid sequence that builds layer upon layer. In this way, Yahweh is revealing himself to be the supreme wisdom teacher. The answer, where does wisdom come from? God alone. Secondly, the content of the Yahweh speeches is expansive. We see no deistic doctrine of first causes, but the hands-on action of the faithful Creator. He not only brings all things into existence, but providentially orders all that he's made in accord with his own knowledge and faithfulness. It is not just that he is Almighty Creator, but the Almighty Faithful Creator because of his sustaining wisdom. Only he is able to do this. Only he can be trusted to do it. The implication is that Job should again trust him. Thirdly, these speeches emphasise the godness of God and the creatureliness of everything else. There is nothing, nowhere, in any place, not even the Satan himself or Leviathan, comparable to God. He is the one and only God. and anything that diminishes this creator-creature distinction has the smell of Hades about it. Job and his friends have to do with God, not with a theology of God, and certainly not with a philosophy of suffering. In wanting to put God on trial, Job has overstepped the mark. In assuming that they can understand the ways of God in simple concepts, the friends have spoken foolishly. Fourthly, the comment has often been made about the amount of space given to the figures of Behemoth and Leviathan in the Yahweh speeches. What are they? Hippopotamus, rhinoceros, elephant, whale, unidentified dinosaurian species. But as Derek Thomas argues, in fact, we should take Leviathan and Behemoth, or Behemoth and Leviathan, as a composite picture, probably ultimately referring to the powers of darkness and evil themselves. And God himself is over them. None of them is beyond his control. So the last paragraph just before some conclusions. None is able to rival him, that is God, for control of the cosmos, because none is holy as he is. By telling of his dominion over Behemoth and Leviathan, Yahweh is celebrating his triumph in the moral sphere. The Satan, the accuser, has been proved wrong, though Job does not know it. The author and the reader see the entire picture which Job and his friends never knew. Some conclusions. Firstly, it should be self-evident, top of page 141, that it is wrong to condemn anyone simply because they are suffering. But the underlying theory of direct retributive justice that surfaces in Job is, in my view, an outcrop of the flesh. As such, we are not surprised to see it formalised and codified in various philosophico-religious systems, on the one hand, or see it emerging in ourselves from time to time on the other. The rigid retributive justice of the three friends and the belief in karma are not a million miles apart. Wherever it occurs, it's folly. But we should not be surprised to see it. In suffering, secondly, we have to deal with God and not with our theories about suffering. The severity of any one person's suffering is not God's public comment on their personal character, nor is the obverse the case. However, when suffering, or prosperity for that matter, comes to us, we must receive it from God and let him shepherd us through it. There is no scattergun approach to providence. The trials of each of us are unique to each, but the matters with which we have to wrestle and the God we meet in the midst are the same. While there may be a secondary cause for our sufferings, ultimately, thirdly, we must receive all things from God's hand. Any trust that is not grounded in him will fail. Even our friends may become our enemies. And we can never put our trust in human flesh, not even our own. The only wise God is the only one we can trust to deal wisely with us. Fourthly, Job is commended for his patient endurance and his righteousness. Suffering does not always pass quickly, and there is need for patient endurance. We're not in a society that wants that now. In this we await the revelation of God, and hereby hangs a tale, for it gives a pattern of understanding New Testament eschatology. Fifthly, Job longed for his advocate to appear. In Christ we now see face to face the one for whom Job longed. In the man Jesus, we have the direct assurance that God is for us, not against us. And in him we have an eternal advocate with the Father against all his enemies. Sixthly, the mystery and the complexity of the creation and God's rule over it as a cause for humble reverence before him. He has set order and boundaries in and over all the creation and attends to it with diligence and care. However, a creation spiritually of itself is sufficient. Spirituality of itself is insufficient, sorry. The Creator is also Redeemer. And indeed, the creation can only be truly understood from within redemption. The book of Job belongs to a redeemed people, and it comes from the covenant relationship with him. This accounts for the vast difference between not only Job's story, but also the wisdom literature of the Old Testament and their surrounding cultures. Job's God is the Redeemer for whom he longs. From the point of view of the New Testament revelation, we stand in and under the cross as our theological north. Only from here may we properly view the twin horizons of creation and new creation. The cross is the final theodicy. Seventhly, if I've got the numbering right, the universe is not a closed system. The Lord is free. He's able also both good and just. The book of Job demonstrates that although practical wisdom is reliable to a certain extent, it must not be taken as the sum of divine wisdom. The wisdom of Yahweh also includes aspects that are mysterious to finite humans. Consequently, humans must not confine Yahweh to their tidy theological formulations or logical constructs. Nextly, there is a scene behind the scenes. True wisdom does not merely go by what is seen with the eyes or heard with the ears. God alone is the true judge, and he's given all judgment to the Son, who's the embodiment of wisdom. Let us not seek to usurp his place. Job's sufferings on earth, nextly, are the arena for God's name to be vindicated in heaven. In like manner, Israel of old, Messiah and New Testament church share in this vocation. God has purposed to display his glory in heaven through that which his people endure here on earth. And lastly, Job became an intercessory priest for his friends. The one who has suffered more than Job could ever imagine is the intercessor and friend of sinners. In times of suffering, we are called not to condemn those who condemn us, but likewise to seek their blessing and their good.